guess what's happened to our Moses? He's been found by Pharaoh's daughter, and she wants somebody to look after him. And to bring Moses up in Pharaoh's palace, and at the same time to be paid for bringing him up, I'm sure it was more than Moses' mother ever expected. This is an amazing story, I believe, of God working his purposes out. When you think about it, the daughter of their greatest enemy was used by God to spare Israel's deliverer. And we read that Moses spent his first 40 years in Pharaoh's palace. And I believe in those 40 years he grew up amidst the grandeur and of Pharaoh's court and experienced the luxury and comfort of a palace. He'd become learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and as Stephen said in Acts 7, he was mighty in word and deed. But although Moses experienced all the wealth of Pharaoh's palace, he was also fully aware of the plight of his fellow Israelites. There's no doubt that his mother had shared with him as she'd brought him up how the Israelites were treated by the Egyptians. And of course Moses could see for himself the burden the Egyptians placed upon his fellow Israelites. When I thought about this, I thought, well, Moses could have ignored the plight of his fellow men and continued living a life of luxury in Pharaoh's palace. But at the age of 40, Moses made a critical decision. He determined not to be identified with the privileged lifestyle he had experienced and been reared with. His choice was instead to be identified with his fellow enslaved Israelites, whose blood and heritage he shared. This would be an amazing choice under any circumstances, but it was even more dramatic when we consider what Moses left behind. He left wealth and education, fame and fortune. He could have achieved much if he had stayed in Pharaoh's palace. But we read that he walked away and he left it all behind. I believe Hebrews 11 explains Moses' choice very well. Hebrews 11 verses 25 to 27. It says of Moses, he chose rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasure of sin in Pharaoh's palace, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than treasures of Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. We see here that Moses saw what was important, and that as he made this decision, he looked beyond the moment in which he was living to see the results of his decision. God gave Moses the wisdom to see that choosing the immediate pleasures of adoption as Pharaoh's grandson didn't deserve to be compared with the lasting honour of standing up to the plight of his own flesh and blood. He couldn't have fully understood what his choice involved at the time. Nevertheless, he left the luxurious environment of Pharaoh's palace to suffer with those who needed his help. And we see how he had a deep concern and compassion for his fellow Israelites. This decision and life-changing event took place when he tried in his own strength to go to the aid of one of his fellow Israelites who was being beaten by an Egyptian taskmaster. And as Moses went to the aid of his fellow Israelites, we read that his emotions took over and he killed the Egyptian and hid his body in the sand. And again, in a speech given by Stephen in Acts 7, we have an insight into why Moses killed the taskmaster. We see there that he was trying to step forward as the deliverer of the slaves in his own strength. And we see here that in a way Moses failed because he was trying to do God's work in his own strength. The tremendous thing is this, isn't it, that with God failure isn't final. God gives us a second chance. And the Bible says that although we may stumble and fall, yet we shall not be utterly cast down. The Lord raises us up and sets us on our journey again and gives us a second chance. So we read that after Moses killed the Egyptian, that Pharaoh sought to take Moses' life, so he had to flee for his life. And we read that he fled to a place called Midian, a place of desert and wilderness, possibly more than 100 miles away. And we read that he was thirsty and he came and he sat by a well. And as he sat there were 7 maidens came to draw water, daughters of Jethro, the priest of Midian. And as they drew water out of the well and put it into the trough for the sheep, we read that some shepherds came along and tried to drive their sheep away, and these girls too. And Moses said, "Now come on, hang on a little bit. This isn't allowed." And so he stood up for the 7 sisters, and he drove the shepherds away and allowed Jethro's 7 daughters to water their flock in peace. And when they got home, Jethro said to his daughters, "How come you're home so soon today?" And they said, "Well, there was this Egyptian, and he helped us to water our sheep. He drove the shepherds away." And Jethro said, "Well, why have you left him there? You should have brought him home for a meal." And so he told them to go and find him, and they found Moses and invited him home for a meal. Now, it doesn't say this, but I believe while he was having the meal, I would imagine that Jethro was asking Moses about his life and asking Jethro gave his daughter Zipporah to be Moses' wife. And so we read that for the next 40 years Moses spent it in the wilderness looking after the flock of sheep belonging to his father-in-law Jethro. What a far cry from the position of power and prosperity that he'd once held in Egypt. Some say, don't they, that life begins at 40, but I think Moses must have felt that life had just ended. This must have been a real shock and a dramatic change in Moses' life. Of course, he had no previous experience with looking after sheep. But possibly that would soon come as he spent the next 40 years in the wilderness. But I believe this was all necessary preparation for the purpose God had in mind for him. Moses, I believe, learnt many skills as he looked after the flock of sheep belonging to his father-in-law Jethro. And as Moses cared for the sheep, and as he took them to fresh pastures daily, and as he brought them to the refreshing water and cared for them, each one individually, I believe, this was all necessary preparation for Moses. These were necessary skills that he could apply when later on he was called of God to guide the children of Israel towards the promised land. And it was also through this wilderness place that the children of Israel were going to travel to the promised land. So it was all, again, good experience. Moses became acquainted with the area. And I believe that also being alone as a shepherd, Moses learnt to communicate with God. He learned humility and submission. He no longer was the self-confident person who had left Egypt 40 years ago. I believe we see here a different Moses, especially when he was called by God at the burning bush. And we know how that Moses saw this bush that was burning, and maybe it was a common thing in that hot, dry land, but this bush was different. It was never consumed, it never burnt out, and Moses said, I'll just go and have a look at this. I've never seen anything like this before. And we read that God spoke to him from the burning bush and told him to take off his shoes from off his feet, because the place where he was standing was holy ground. And so Moses did just that, as a mark of respect and reverence as God was speaking to him. And it's worthwhile noting, I believe, here Moses' answer when God spoke to him and called his name. He said, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, here am I. In other words, Moses was saying, Lord, I'm available. But this time Moses didn't step forward in his own strength. He knew that if anything was to be achieved, it would only be through God's strength alone. And God told him that he'd heard the cry of the children of Israel, and he'd seen how the Egyptians had treated them so badly. And he said, now Moses, I want you to go and deliver the children of Israel and set them free from Egypt. We read that Moses felt so inadequate now that he began to make excuses. And there's 4 excuses that he made. Now I just mentioned them briefly. Number 1, he said he was personally unfit for the job. He was not adequate to do it. We read that in Exodus 3:11. And then in Exodus 4:1, Moses said that he feared that the people wouldn't believe him. And his excuse number 3 was his lack of eloquence. He said, I'm not a good speaker. Exodus 4:10. And then his 4th excuse was, please Lord, send someone else to do this job. But each time Moses made an excuse, God promised his presence and his provision, and because of the lack of time, I'm not going to go through all them promises, but God did promise his presence. He says, I will certainly be with you. And many other things he promised. And in a sense, Moses couldn't get out of it because God had promised so much for him. Here we find that God commanded Moses to go and set the people free. And God said, You must go and remind my people of the religion and the belief of their fathers Abraham, Isaac and Jacob. You must go and remind them that I am the Lord, I am the great I am. No, he didn't say I was, but he said I am. I'm the God who is the same yesterday, today and forever. And this is a truth that we discover throughout the whole of the Bible, that God said in Malachi 3:6, I am the Lord and I change not. So that's an encouraging word for us even today. And we read that as Moses stepped forward in command and obedience to God, that he experienced the presence and the provision and the power of God as he went to do this great task. Not doing it in his own way, but in doing it God's way. And I came across a statement made by Hudson Taylor, the founder of the China Inland Mission, which I believe is an amazing statement, and it's very true. This is what he said: God's work done in God's way will never lack God's abundant supply. And this was what God was saying to Moses as he went forward to deliver the children of Israel. What a daunting task it must have been. And no wonder Moses felt inadequate. But we see as Moses steps forward in obedience to God's command that when he calls someone, he also equips them for the job that's needed. And as Moses led the children of Israel into the promised land, he faced many difficulties and many challenges. Yet through it all he proved God's faithfulness as he exercised faith and trust in a God who is all sufficient. And whatever we experience along life's journey, we can trust God's hand upon us. And there are times when we do go through difficult circumstances, times of real challenge. And I'll just close with a verse that I found some time ago, and it says, God has a purpose in our heartaches. The Saviour always knows what's best. We learn so many precious lessons in every sorrow, trial and test. And I believe Moses experienced this, and we can experience it too as we trust the Lord. Now our closing